First, I want your calls on this. It's an iconic London landmark, but is Queen Victoria's memorial to her husband Albert offensive? There it is there. Now, the monument's custodians, Royal Park, says that it is because it reflects Victorian views of the world. But are they right about that? 0207 862 2222 is the number for your views on this. Now, before I open this up to the panel and to you at home, let's just take a closer look at the monument to find out what the Royal Parks are suggesting is offensive. So there's 4 statues that surround Albert at the top, and this is one of them. This represents Asia, and as we can see here, it's depicted as a woman riding on the back of an elephant, so playing into stereotypes there maybe. And then we have America. This is again depicting a Native American with a bison, accused of being a stereotype, and Africa, a woman riding a camel. Now, in the African sculpture as well, it also includes a white European woman reading a book to a black African tribesman who has broken chains at his feet. Now, this alludes to Britain's role in the abolition of slavery. So, with all of that in mind, can you see where they're coming from, Yasmin?
Of course I can. And it's not a matter of being offensive or not. It's a matter of actually, explaining why this woman does not look African, for starters. Her features are entirely European. Okay, African women don't have that nose. African women don't look like that. They have a different and extraordinary beauty of their own. And this idea, I grew up in the empire. The number of times it was banged into our heads that the empire was about civilizing the rest of us. And you never get over that. I mean, who are you to think that you would civilize us? There were huge civilizations in Africa, which none of us were taught. I grew up in Africa. We were never taught about the incredible civilization, the Benin civilization, or Uganda, where I grew up. So it's a question of giving information. It's not a new thing. There's a statue built to Mary Wollstonecraft by Maggie Hamlin about 5-6 years ago in Islington, London, okay? And she made, Mary Wollstonecraft is the mother of British feminism, and she created this statue, which I hate, which was of a naked woman, absolutely naked.
I remember this being in the papers.
Yeah, and feminists, many feminists, including me, said, she wasn't a body, she had a brilliant mind. She died in childbirth. What are you doing turning her into a sex object? These conversations have been happening all throughout history. The anti-slavery things.
Do we have to forgive this statue, this monument, somewhat for the time that it was built?
But they're not pulling it down, are they? They're just giving you information. They're giving you the arguments. That's fine.
So you don't want this monument to be pulled down? You don't expect it to,
but
maybe
I do want the information.
A QR code somewhere that you could scan it and then read up on what all the statues are supposed to
and have a conversation with yourself
depict.
Or with others. I mean, that's all it is.
I have to say, I passed the Albert Memorial Monument many a time. Never ever did I think about what the 4 statues stood for or thought very much about it, and maybe that's the fault of the general public then, Danielle?
Well, possibly. Look, we're educated people, and when we realise that these mistakes have been made and then we provide information, that's all we can do as we move forward. What we have to be very careful to do is not destroy a representation of our past, because in making those mistakes, changes are made. So it's not. I'm very much for education. I'm very much against vandalisation. I'm very much against destroying and rewriting history because it suits. I think it needs to exist as it is. Whether that comes with a reasonable explanation that allows people who are offended to feel like, well, OK, this has been covered, then absolutely, that's society we live in.
We're no longer a white country. We haven't been a white country since the 17th century, actually. And there are people going to see these monuments for whom this is deeply meaningful, one way or another.
So, Danielle, can you understand, though, I understand you don't want the statue to be pulled down and you want some information, but can you understand if you're an Asian person living in Britain or a British person with Asian ancestry, this would be a little bit offensive for you, playing into stereotypes?
If you can't see past when it was built, and who it was dedicated to and that era of time, and you can't see that was perfectly acceptable in that time, I think the word snowflake comes back to mind again. I think it's ridiculous. The truth is we have moved on. We know it's not right. We know these stereotypes are not right, and we're providing the information so that people can say, oh right, well, so that was made then, but looking back on it now, through education and development, we've realised that that's not so great.
One of the things that I absolutely have to correct is that people at that time didn't think about any of these. There were huge debates in the Victorian period, including with Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria called her own family and her courtiers racist. She used that word because they were so horrible to her Muslim servants. There were all kinds of discussions. During the age of slavery, the anti-slavery abolitionists, especially Quakers, were discussing this all the time. So the idea that we now know and they didn't is just wrong.
Well, with that in mind, and I didn't know that information there, Yasmin, with that in mind, when we look at this monument, which was commissioned by Queen Victoria, someone very aware, someone woke to the issues, or even in her current day, do we have to look at the intention behind this? Obviously, the intention was therefore not to be racist because at that time she was quite advanced.
It's not about intention.
Okay.
It's not about intention. I mean, she understood. It's so interesting. She really understood how racism played out.
So why did she allow something like this to be built?
Because she absolutely adored her husband.
Yeah, but because she could have just left it at the gold monument of her husband and not had the 4 statues around it. But certainly, the
African woman not looking African, this Asian woman, no Asian woman would be quite so...
bare-chested. Why do you think they constructed it in that way then? Why would they make an African woman not look particularly African?
But they did know, and they were always having debates. They were always having debates about the meaning of empire, and this is why Clive of India, his statues, I mean, that one does offend me hugely, because even in his time, in our parliament, he stole so much loot. He was the East India Company man.
Okay.
He stole so much loot from India that in our parliament, he was condemned. And in the end, he committed suicide.
Oh.
You learn everything on your programme.
Well, from you mostly, Yasmin. Okay.
Oh, that lady will be very cross.
She will. No. We've got some messages coming in on this. So we're asking basically, is the Albert Memorial offensive? Do you find it offensive? Tina on Facebook says, tell the woke brigade to get lost, stop trying to destroy our history. Nothing offensive about this structure. The past is the past, get over it. Oh, Tina, I'm going to put this to Daniela. I'm going to put the counter argument to this because I think, Tina, you would probably agree with Tina a little bit there, Daniela.
I do think we have to be I don't think people quite realise the severity of destroying. What you've got to remember is in 100 years, we won't be here. We won't be here to make an explanation. So surely an explanation is a better idea than tearing down history. We have to be very careful that we don't destroy the past that we've learned from. Yeah,
so I think your panel certainly in agreement with just putting a plaque that has a little bit more information on it. I suppose it's the idea of the past is the past, just get over it. Do you think that is an unfair statement to make with perhaps British people living in this country whose ancestors come from areas that we colonised?
Isn't it interesting how indigenous British, native Britons love the past when they're glorifying themselves? They cannot get over the past. You know, Germans have said to me, when are the Brits going to get over the war? But I don't dare say that because that past is deeply meaningful and must go on and on and on because they were winners.
You see, I in both arguments here, I always say, regardless of that, the truth is we don't live in the past. And in fact, by living in the past, you can make yourself quite poorly. Like with your mental health issues, the idea is to be in the present moment because constantly living in the past can cause depression, worrying about the future causes anxiety. That's an actual fact. So we shouldn't be living in the past anyway. We should look at art as it stands, appreciate it and learn from it. Yeah. Take lessons and education from it, not destroy it.
Ian from Inverness, what do you think about this statue? Do you think it's offensive?
I certainly don't. Oh, hi, Storm, and Azabrai Brown as well. Just to say, no, it's not. If you look at the statue, particularly that to do with the woman sitting on the camel, well, if you actually look at it, the headdress is actually Egyptian.
Yeah, well, I wondered that actually, Ian. I'm glad you brought that up because you say, because Egyptians have a very different look than perhaps a Somalian or somebody that comes from South Africa.
And on top of that...
And so I wonder whether that's what this is supposed to represent, because a camel said to me Egypt and it didn't say to me any other country in Africa.
That's and that headdress is definitely Egyptian.
But even still, are we not playing into stereotypes here, Ian?
Speak a minute. If you look also where what's in her hand, you'll notice it's a
crook.
It's a crook, which is from Egyptian times again.
Okay, but
and
Ian,
the
that's
chains
fine.
on the ground is to do with Britain been abolishing the slave trade, so there's that. And Prince Albert was in fact, he actually went to meetings for the abolition of the slave trade in the empire.
Well, Ian,
and by the way,
what we've heard from Yasmin is actually that it would appear that Victoria and Albert were very ahead of their time in dealing with racism and those sorts of issues. And I totally take your point that actually this looks more like a depiction of Egypt to me, which is in the African continent. It is a depiction of continent. So, but what I put to you then, Ian, even if that is specifically Egypt, it's still playing on stereotypes.
Well, why? Because for instance, Egypt obviously has been mainly Islamic, although it's Christianity. It goes way back to the early times of Christianity. But obviously you've got the sort of Arab influence about who's done by the woman's feet on the camel and so on.
I can't see that far down. But listen, I take your point. So you don't think there has to be even maybe a little mount to explain the context of which this monument was built? You think it should stand as it is, and that's absolutely fine?
I think it's absolutely fine myself.
Well, there you
and
go.
by the way, Yasmin, I used to live in Uganda, Borup Avenue in Kampala, by the way. So I can speak from multiple things. And I've been to Egypt, and I've been to Sudan,
Ian,
and I've lived in Uganda and Kenya as well.
Well, you see, one of the things is you come from where you come from, and I come from where I come from. And I was one of the colonized, and you were part of the colonial machinery. We see the world very differently.
No,
Yeah?
well, but you've got to remember there was very few Europeans in East Africa, and most of it was actually, all the work was done by local people and trained to do stuff by local people.
Ian, I have to say, the conversation between you and Yasmin was getting very interesting there. Unfortunately, I am going to have to wrap up, but I'm going to thank you very much for your call.